Hi folks, welcome to Bear Mountain today. We're working on one of the first plantings that we're going to be doing this year. And since we are kind of looking at our vegetable situations, there's certain things in the vegetable side of things that we want to start early. Today is January 17th, and this is the prime time to start things like the alliums, particularly your onions, shallots, and maybe even leeks. For going into, in our zone 8B, for going into the long day. So the reason we're doing it this year in terms of kind of looking in the past, we've used like 6-packs and things because we were producing a lot of other things in flowers in terms of a commercial level. But since we are retired now, what we're kind of looking at is saying, well, we're going to start going back the other way where we used to try to do soil blocking totally for making our flower production. We think at our reduced level of what we're doing for vegetables that we can go back and do things on a soil block basis. So what we're going to kind of cover today is, making up your own mix. We're going to be using our own compost and some peat-based Pro Mix and perlite. And then we have some basic minerals and some limestone to add to it to kind of just give the overall mix a nice texture and make a good strong block. Okay, so I'm going to kind of delve into here in terms of how we're going to make the mix. We're going to be using our stand-up blocker today to make, they're basically 1 inch by 1 inch by 1.5 inch soil blocks. And what we can do when we're using our stand-up blocker, and we'll show you how to do this, is you can get 105 of those individual blocks in a cell. But what we're going to do is make our own custom mix. Sometimes you can buy, depending on where you are, a custom-made mix that's made for soil blocking, and that's fine. But in our case, we've never really had access to that. So we did videos before on how we were making soil block mix for large quantities, and we were using our cement mixer to make up a large amount. In this case, we're only going to be making what we want to use today and then store the individual components so that we can bring them out and make more of it as we need it. So instead of making up a big, huge block of this stuff, since we're not doing the level and number of trays that we used to do, we're just going to kind of oriented to what we're going to get done today. And today, like I said, we're planting onions today. So back in October, we turned our own compost pile. I think we did a video on our new composting system, and you can check that out if you go back to our playlist, Farm Life and Balance. It should be in there. And this compost here was our first batch. We turned it and flipped it into an aging pile around the end of October. And so this is not as aged as long as 6 months, but we got a good almost 3 months out of this. And we went through and we sifted it, and we have a sifter, and we actually have a video on that too if you go back and look for our compost sifter, and how we built it and how we used it. And this is our sifted compost, which has a really nice texture to it, and it's nice chocolate brown color to it, so it's not that black color that you get from like urban waste compost or even bagged compost. So there's a lot of biologic life in this. And these soil blocks that we're going to make today is we're going to be using this at about 3 parts, and then we're going to put in 3 parts of the peat, and then we're going to add the perlite to it at about 1 to 2 parts on that, depending on that's a little bit by feel. And then we'll put in a cup of our mineral mix into it, and that should be probably pretty good for making at least 4 to 5 trays. So if we look at it and say what's a part, I mean, you can do all kinds of different things. This is like a pretty much a 4-gallon bucket. This one here is about a 1-gallon bucket. So we're going to be using the 1-gallon bucket, and cat components are optional. She's going to have to get out of there pretty quick. So I'm going to put in 3 parts of this compost. There's 1. Okay, you're going to have to get out of the way, bud. Yeah, look at that, huh? And this stuff aged up really well. And the nice thing about this is we used a similar technique that Charles Dowding did when we made the compost, is we only turned it once. And it's amazing. It was a lot less effort, and the material just came out really super. It's even got its own set of worms to it. And that's part of the reason too why we're not going to bring, we're going to keep these guys outside in terms of our greenhouse. So, you know, if a little worm decides to crawl out, it's not going to be that big of a deal.
The other aspect on that is these are 1-inch blocks.
Yes.
They're rather heavy, and so rather than taking a risk and bringing them into the house, you know, and the tray collapsing or something, we just will run these through the greenhouse out here. The mini blocks that we do can go inside, but anything like that's bigger and heavier does not go inside.
Right. Now this material's been sitting for probably about 4 months. So the top layer or so of this Pro Mix has kind of gotten a bit solid. So it'll take us a little bit to get it all in here. I'm gonna have to kind of break it up by hand. I mean, a new bag of it, if you just opened up, you know, if it was peat moss or this type of thing, it would have more moisture in it. And so that's one of the things that happens over time, is these guys tend to dry out. We don't store our potting mix once we, you know, like the Pro Mix or anything like that outside, so we keep it out of the elements. And like I said, we're going to put 2 parts of this in. I want to make sure that, because it's kind of chunky, I may actually use 2.5 buckets, because I know I got airspace in here.
Boy, compared to the compost, it looks dry.
Yeah, it's pretty dry. It's always fun. Now, there's one advantage of buying your own mix, is you can, you know, start out pretty much, you know, or not making your own mix, but buying mix, you can, you know, you're pretty much good to go right away.
So one of the reasons that we are choosing the 1-inch block for our onions is it will then remove a step out of the process. It won't need to be bumped up, it'll just be planted directly into the garden. We have a lot of big projects, so we're kind of looking at where can we streamline the process, you know, and some of like the smaller projects, and get them to have less steps in them, and you know, so we have more time for the big projects.
Yeah, and then the other part of it is one of the aspects of plastic that's always bothered us is, even though we got a lot of useful life out of the 6-packs, and we still have a fair amount of them left because we actually used a lot of them, you know, for the last few years of our flower farming adventure. I think, you know, we'll eventually, as they break down, we'll just move away and go back to this, because the volume level is slower. The biggest drawback that we had with soil blocking to use on a commercial basis was it just took too much time.
Yep.
And but it did make a better product, and I think, you know, that aspect of it is something that you know, we just couldn't get past the labor issue, you know, the amount of time.
Well, the efficiency of the 3/4-inch blocks was great. You could do a whole lot of stuff in a very small footprint. But then after that, to bump them up into the next level was time consuming when example, you would do 4 trays of snapdragons. That's 1,200 blocks. And they got to go somewhere too when you bump them up. We were never successful in making the mini 3/4 inch block go directly to the garden or the field.
Yeah, some people could do that really well,
but we just couldn't get it.
We found that it if you fed it enough fertilizer, yeah, you'd still keep a good green top to the plant, but the root systems they really had to work to get past the fact that you can strain that root system for too long, in a 3/4 inch block. The whole idea of that 3/4 mini was that it get it sprouted up and maybe to the first set of true leaves on something, and then you would transplant that in, as quickly as possible into, a larger, like 2-inch block. And it's a good system, but again, it's just not efficient from a labor standpoint. And it took a lot more mix for what we could tell. It did deliver a better plant, but it was more expensive and took more time. There just wasn't the reward on the back end, in terms of when you finally got your product sold. It just added cost to the whole structure, and it didn't make any sense. But from a home gardening standpoint, I think soil blocks get you a superior plant, and there's less root shock. And these 1-inch, when they came out with that 1-inch stand-up blocker, I think it was their idea of how to more efficiently use a 10-inch by 20-inch tray, which kind of became the industry standard. And that helped because you could get 105 of those cells in a 10-inch by 20-inch tray. It's basically
instead of like 72.
Yeah, instead of 72 or 84. And it was a nice compromise between, a 1.5 inch block. It always came down to this: is you always had either a row on the outside or an extra row on the inside. So even if you were using the stand-up blocker for like a 2-inch blocks, you'd have to go back and hand make
small ones to fit in.
Enough extra charges to fill the tray, and that was also. And if you didn't fill the tray, you were wasting space, shelf space, grow-on space. So it had a whole series of issues. Okay, I still got quite a few chunks in there, but when I get water in there, that'll break that up. So the next thing I'm going to do is put in extra perlite, because I want to have good loft. And I'm using, this is plug grade, so it's pretty fine. You could also use a vermiculite. I'm not going to be using, the more coarse grade perlite. Oh, it's kind of blowing in the wind here. Oh, I'll have something to sweep up. And I'm going to use 1 part of this. You kind of got to be careful with this stuff because it's really light, and if you're got any kind of air movement, it's going to blow around pretty easy.
You might want to wear a mask, especially if you're indoors.
Yeah, well, yeah. And then the very last thing I'm going to add. Now this has got azomite, limestone, and a little bit of soft rock phosphate. That's calcium phosphate. So all this stuff will add a significant amount of calcium, helps balance the pH, and will also help with minerals, basic minerals. Not so much when the plant is growing in the block, but definitely when you transplant it in the ground, you're just kind of putting a little mineral charge right by them. So this is the basic it, and you just make sure it's mixed up really well. You know, that it's as uniformly spread around in it as you can get. Now the peat will help a little bit with loft, but it's got really good moisture retention. If you don't want to use peat, you could use core. I know that's getting popular too, but you know, there's a lot of people that think, you know, that the peat is a finite resource and is being exploited, but actually this material is from peat farms in northern Alberta. It's actually a crop raised. They have bogs that they flood and they harvest from, and this isn't like, you know, they're going out and digging up bogs up in the forest or somewhere, you know, near a forest. This is a actually cultivated crop, kind of like Christmas trees. You know, there's a lot of folks that think sometimes, well, Christmas trees are going out into the forest and taking the trees, and it's actually not. It's raised like a crop, just like wheat or corn. And it's kind of the same thing with this peat. But, you know, it's a personal choice. Either one works. All right, we got the mix ready. We had some extra, so I just put it in an old peat moss bag over here. And then one of the things you always need to do when you're making soil block is make sure you pull off some extra dry mix. You know, don't wet everything down, because as you're stamping these guys out, what happens is you're pressing out any excess water, and that will be left usually in the tray or the thing you're working with. And that extra mix, then you need to add that in to constantly keep the consistency just right. This is the stand-up 35 blocker, and you can tell you got 5 on this side and 7 on this side. And what we're going to do is we're going to be using this guy and stamp them out in our mortar tray where we mixed, and we'll be applying them into our 10 inch by 20 inch tray. And we're using the weave bottom, and the only reason we use a weave bottom like this instead of a more open bottom is to keep as much material from falling out as possible. If you use, particularly in these smaller blocks, if you use something that's a wider mesh, the chances are they won't stay in it, or they may get damaged. And this, you can get these, Johnny sells them, Nursery Supplies place sells them. I think you could maybe even get them on Amazon too, I'm not certain. Check out our Amazon storefront, because I think we actually have some links to these guys in there. And then we made this homemade jig, because one of the things that you find when you're stamping out is the tray will move around as you try to line up, you know, charges next to each other. And this is just a quick and dirty little jig of a piece of plywood with a couple of 2x2s screwed to it. And what that enables us to do is to put our 10 inch by 20 inch tray, rest it right in there, so that when we're putting our charge in, we can tuck it, put our foot right behind it and tuck it right up to the edge. We'll charge and release. And then the next one, you can kind of keep the tray lined up, and that way you don't have any problems with it moving around on you or getting too much of a gap in between your charges or something like that nature. A lot of people use a bucket of water to keep, you know, maybe dip this thing into. And what I found is it's a little difficult with this particular size to fill a bucket and get I mean, it does fit, but the tapered bottom is such that you can't get all the way down. But if you go down and you kind of do it at an angle, you can kind of get away with that. But if you had an extra tray, another mortar tray that just had some water in it, that would work too. So it's a little bit, it's just a matter of putting some extra water in there to keep it primed. You don't have to dip it between every charge. A lot of people do that, but
we do with the little blocks.
I dip. Basically, I'm using the mini blocks. I dip once when I stop, but I'll do multiple charges without dipping it. I mean, they kind of recommend, oh yeah, keep dipping it in between charges, but the reality is I found you really don't need to do that. So, how wet do you make the mix? That's always been a question for people. And cats don't like water, so we make it as like it would look like mortar that you put in between bricks. So it's kind of that level of moisture. So I start out and I put in, you know, maybe half of what I would probably have in total for moisture. It really just kind of depends on how dry your overall mix is. We had a lot of dry peat in here, so this is probably going to take quite a bit of actual moisture to get it to the level. And a really easy test, and we'll show you this, is, you know, say, well, what's the consistency of mortar? Is like, well, once you get to the right level of moisture, what you can find is the material. If you take up a small handful of it and just kind of pitch it against the side of your mixing tray, if it sticks to the side, it's ready to go. And that's kind of been the rule of thumb that we've always used.
Like spaghetti.
It's like, yeah, like a pasta test, right? Throw it on the wall.
Spaghetti at the wall, and if it sticks, it's ready.
Right. Now, if you make a mistake and you make it too wet, don't worry about it. You got extra mix. And that's the whole point of that, is it's like, so it's not gonna, you know, you're not gonna ruin it and throw it out, you know, and if you got it a little too wet. And if it's too dry, it's not gonna release from the blocker right. It's gonna stick in it, and you're gonna have incomplete fill and all that. Like this right now, you'd say, oh, that's moist. It's not.
It looks moist, but
it's not wet enough. It shouldn't fall apart. It should, in a sense, almost feel a little plasticness.
What?
See what happens when you get mine stuck and you can't.
What?
I know the word. I just can't speak it. So that's kind of, and then sometimes too, you know, if you have a really dry mix, you start with a really dry mix and you go, I think it's just right. Give it a rest, you know, once you got it mixed where you think it's just right, give it a rest and then test it and see if it's, you know, because this stuff will continue to absorb water and expand. And it may end up being that, you know, what looked like it was wet enough, 10 minutes later is not, you know. So that can happen. If you start with a really damp mix, you may find that you don't have to add as much water. So you got to kind of, you know, play the whole water thing. You got to play it by ear. You can't just say, if I use this number of gallons of mix, I put in this many gallons of water. It doesn't work that way. It's all by feel. And like I said, if you don't get it right, like it doesn't stay in the blocker or it won't come out, that's 99% of the time that's a moisture problem. You could have an issue if it sticks in the blocker because you left too much coarse material in your mix. In other words, maybe there's some small sticks of wood or undecomposed material. If you find something like that, like this, just get rid of it. Don't worry about it. And so this material will also become a lot more dense. So its volume is going to shrink because you're removing the air and replacing it with water. I'm pretty close on this one. But it's still too dry. And you'll get that way by experience. The reason why I say it's too dry, if I come in and I look at it, what I see that it's clumpy. You know, if I squeeze it, it'll kind of stick together. But it doesn't stick to the wall of my bin. Well, some parts do.
Some parts do.
But I can tell from just experience that I'm really close on this, but not close enough.
How long have we been doing soil blocks? How many years?
Well, I think I started on it almost 10 years ago, actually. I really became enamored with the idea because it seemed like, wow, it removed, you know, plastic, and it was just...
Yet there's a whole cart full of plastic behind you.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, like I said, you know, when we started trying to apply it to a commercial basis with equipment that's really designed for, you know, a different scale, it didn't work. See, now I can feel that this is definitely wet enough, and it feels like mortar.
Throw it to the back wall.
Sticks.
It sticks. Just do it again. I want to get a close up.
Okay. All right, you got a close up?
Yeah.
All right. Didn't stick.
Did the first time.
Stuck the second time. I threw it too hard. If you throw it too hard, it will bounce off.
Goes bouncing off.
So, like I said, if you see any sticks or stuff, just kind of pull them out. Don't worry about them. Now, before we actually start stamping these guys out, I'm going to kind of pile this stuff up, and I want it to be about twice the height of the block that I'm trying to make, roughly. It's not a perfect, but so that's the idea. All right. Now the one thing I didn't do is wet my blocker down, so I'm gonna wet my blocker down. I cheated. I'm wetting my blocker down. Okay.
We also were going to mention very quickly that to our side here.
Oh yeah. Well, we were talking about onions, and this is wild onions. It's kind of a scourge in a sense, but it's like one of the first. It's the first thing that germinates in our early spring. I mean, they are edible technically, but they're really not very good.
But it does tell you what time it is.
But it says, you know,
the season.
Nature's saying it's onion time.
Yep.
Okay, so we're gonna put the blocker in. Okay, this bar right here is what you're gonna push down on first to actually fill the blocker and the charge. Don't push this down, because what you're doing is you're actually...
That's the release.
That's the release, okay? So you wanna hang on to the outside of this, and you wanna give it a good charge and a twist until you see some moisture coming out of the top. You know, you can tell that the individual cells are full, you know, and if you see material coming out the top, if you don't, you know, just kind of move it around, maybe give it a little extra charge, and that's about it. Then we come over and we line ourselves up in our tray. You notice my foot position, so I'm right where I want to be. Press down, release. Sometimes you got to give it a little extra, and voila, we have 35 blocks.
Okay, and it has a dibble in it that creates the little hole. Is this the small dibble? Or?
Yeah, this would be called the shallow dibble.
Okay.
I don't think you'd want to do the long dibble in this.
Right.
Because a long dibble is usually used for like the 1.5 inch or 2 inch blocks, and that allows you to plant bigger seeds, like
deeper.
Yeah, like a bean or a sunflower. In this case, these are going to be fairly shallowly planted.
Yeah, so
like
you're looking
seeds.
for the shallow dibble.
Right.
Creates the little hole.
So then I do it again. Looks like I got it full. Now in this case, I'm going to make certain that I'm tucked up right next to the last one I did.
And everybody comes out.
And everybody comes out. Well, only on YouTube.
Every other time?
Yeah. So if you look at the bottom, you can see they all got
Wait.
charged.
I'm not there. Okay.
So if you look at the bottom, you can see they're all fully charged. It even comes with its own little worm.
That's why they're going to be out here.
That's why they're going to be out here. So then, there we go, full tray.
Well, but there's like a little bit of space still at the end.
There's enough for another row.
If you do it by hand.
If you do it by hand. But honestly, this is a pretty efficient use of this tray.
Right. Because it does give you a little spot for putting your tag to say what the heck you're growing.
Yeah. Or if you really don't want your charges right next to each other because for whatever reason you say, well, I can tell this is where one variety ended and another began, it gives you a little room to spread it out if you wanted to. So you can put a little gap in there and go, oh,
but
okay.
That's 105.
This is 105, yeah.
In a tray, so.
Right. Well, our weather went a little cattywampus on us, and we started getting a rain shower, and it got wetter and wetter, so we kind of called it off for the rest of today. But we did get our soil block trays made, and our next step is planting, and we're going to be doing a video on that one coming up. So I want to thank you guys for watching what we did today. And again, the big soil blocker. This guy actually did a pretty good job for us. And I'm thinking we're going to be using that kind of thing, you know, more in the future as we do our vegetables and things of that nature. Again, we can go either way. I mean, we have our 6-packs, you know, that we've used in the flower business. So we'll probably still use a few of those from time to time. But for the majority of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to use to make it so we make our own mix as much as possible, cut the costs down, and use stuff that we already have and is sustainable. So in essence, we won't have to buy more plastic or things of that nature. So that's kind of the purpose of where we're at. I want to thank you guys for watching today and catch the next video where we show you planting out the onions. Bye-bye.